In 1431, one of the greatest cities on earth was erased, not by natural disaster, not by disease, but by a deliberate invasion. Brutal, patient, and irreversible. From the west, Ayutthaya was advancing, and when the gates of Angkor finally gave way, it wasn't just a city that fell. It was the end of an empire. In the dying light of a Southeast Asian dusk, where ancient stone faces stare silently into the encroaching jungle, one question still haunts the ruins of Angkor. How does the greatest empire of its age simply vanish? Is it possible for a civilization that mastered the very flow of water and built mountains out of stone to just breathe its last? For centuries, the Khmer kings were seen as living gods, their authority as unshakable as the giant roots of the banyan trees. But even gods can bleed when the tide of history begins to turn. In the year 1431, the balance of power in Southeast Asia shifted forever. What had been a tense, decades-long rivalry between two formidable kingdoms finally exploded into a decisive and devastating conflict. For generations, the Khmer Empire and the rising kingdom of Ayutthaya had clashed along uncertain borders. Not merely over land, but over something far greater: control of vital trade routes, dominance of regional commerce, and the ultimate claim to political supremacy. Ayutthaya was the young, hungry predator, a rising power, looking to the sea and the future. Angkor was the aging lion, still majestic, but heavy, burdened by the weight of its own past. And the tension between them was more than political. It was a collision between two different worlds. These were not isolated skirmishes. They were part of a relentless cycle of raid and retaliation. A cycle that drained both sides, yet neither could afford to back down. The stakes were existential. Whoever controlled the fertile plains and river networks controlled the food supply and the strength of armies. Whoever dominated the trade routes could dictate the future of the region. But beyond the battlefield, this was also a war of adaptation. The world was changing. Maritime trade was expanding. Coastal powers were rising, and the old inland empires were being forced to evolve or fall behind. Ayutthaya adapted to that shift. Angkor did not, at least not fast enough. And so the conflict endured year after year, wearing down resources, testing endurance, pushing both empires toward their limits. By the early 15th century, the Khmer Empire was no longer at its peak. Prolonged warfare had weakened its military. Internal rivalries fractured political unity. And perhaps most critically, the vast hydraulic system that had sustained Angkor for centuries was beginning to fail. The barrays, those vast man-made reservoirs, once the heartbeat of the empire, were choking on silt. The monsoon rains, once predictable, turned erratic, from devastating floods to soul-crushing droughts. And when the sky itself stopped cooperating, the divine mandate of the kings began to wither alongside the rice field. Canals clogged, reservoirs weakened, The land itself seemed to withdraw its support. Inside the empire, these changes were not abstract. They were felt in daily life, in uncertain harvests, in rising pressure on labor, in whispers of instability that spread through markets, temples, and homes. An empire does not collapse all at once, it frays, slowly, from within. Angkor still stood, but it was no longer invincible. Meanwhile, Ayutthaya had been preparing. Its rulers built a more centralized state, a more disciplined army, and a clearer vision of the future. They studied their rival. They understood its strengths. And more importantly, its weaknesses. They understood one thing above all. As long as Angkor stood strong, Ayutthaya could never dominate. So in 1431, they made their decision. Ayutthaya launched a major campaign, not a raid, not a temporary incursion, but a calculated, sustained military operation. This was not about winning a battle. It was about ending a rivalry that had lasted generations. Their forces advanced methodically. Supply lines cut, trade routes severed, the city isolated. Imagine the terror of those within the walls, watching the horizon darken with the smoke of approaching armies. The golden spires of the Bayonne still reached for the heavens, but on the ground, the air was thick with fear and wood smoke. The great city, after 5 centuries, was being suffocated. Time itself became a weapon. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Inside Angkor, food supplies dwindled, disease spread, morale began to collapse. Families rationed what little remained. Soldiers stood their ground, knowing relief might never come. And with each passing day, the silence grew heavier. And slowly, resistance faded. When the final breach came, it was overwhelming. Ayutthaya's soldiers poured into the city. What followed was not chaos, but systematic destruction. The invaders didn't come just for gold. They came to erase a civilization. They stripped the temples of their sacred treasures and led away the scholars, the artists, the craftsmen, the very mind of the empire. Taken back to Ayutthaya, what remained was not a city, but a hollow shell, bleeding in silence. The capital was looted, structures damaged, abandoned. Many inhabitants were captured, taken away as prisoners, or forcibly relocated. Not just a defeat, but a dismantling of everything that made Angkor possible. This was not random brutality. It was strategy. Remove the people, and you remove the future. Break the system, and the empire collapses. And in that moment, Angkor ceased to function as a center of power. The consequences were profound. The Khmer court made a decision. They would not rebuild Angkor because they could not. Instead, they moved south, toward the Mekong River, toward what would later become Phnom Penh. They chose the moving waters of the river over the stagnant canals of the past. It was a retreat, yes, but also a fight to survive. A realization that the age of God Kings was over, and something new, quieter, more fragile, had to begin. Power shifted, geography shifted, history shifted. Angkor was not abandoned overnight, but slowly, quietly, it was left behind. Without maintenance, the water systems failed completely. Without people, the city lost its purpose. Trees took root between the stones. The jungle returned. Nature finished what war had begun, and the once great capital became a ghost. For Ayutthaya, this victory was transformative. They had removed their greatest rival. They rose as the dominant power in the region. Trade networks expanded. Influence deepened. Their moment had arrived. Not by chance, but by timing, preparation, and opportunity. For centuries, Ayutthaya would shape the balance of power. The center had shifted from Khmer to Thai. But history is rarely that simple. To say Ayutthaya destroyed Angkor is only part of the truth. Because long before 1431, Angkor was already weakening. Years of war, internal division, environmental strain had already begun to erode its foundation. Empires rarely collapse from a single blow. They collapse because they can no longer withstand one. Ayutthaya did not create that collapse. They revealed it. They delivered the final blow to a system already failing. The stones of Angkor still stand today, etched with stories of gods and demons. A silent witness to one simple truth. Greatness is fragile. Because when the systems fail and the people lose faith, even the grandest walls become nothing more than stones, waiting for the jungle to return. And that is the deeper lesson. Empires do not fall in a single moment. They decline quietly, gradually, until one day a single event makes the collapse undeniable. Angkor did not die in 1431. It simply could not survive it. The fall of Angkor marked the end of an era, but it was not the end of a people. The Khmer adapted. They endured, and their legacy remained. The temples still stand, not as symbols of defeat, but as echoes of a civilization that learned to survive change.
As you can see, the carvings here represent Avalokiteshvara, the Bodhisattva of compassion.
The history still echoes, not as a memory of defeat, but as a reminder of resilience. And as we look back at 1431, we are not only witnessing the end of a city, but a timeless warning that power, however great, is never permanent. And sometimes the one who defeats you is not the strongest, but the one who arrives when you are at your weakest.